Listen closely, because something has shifted, and you can feel it. The people who once believed every accusation, every rumor, and every twisted version of your story are finally starting to see what was really happening. For so long, your name was dragged into arguments you never started, conflicts you never wanted, and conversations you never asked to be part of. They made you look like the problem because it was easier than admitting the truth. But now people are exhausted. They are tired of hearing the same arguments, tired of watching the same person create unnecessary drama, and tired of being expected to choose sides. Something has become impossible to ignore. You were never the source of the chaos. You simply became the person who stopped feeding it. And that silence is speaking louder than every accusation ever made against you. While they were busy explaining why you were supposedly difficult, you were quietly changing. While they were trying to convince everyone that you were the villain, your actions kept contradicting their story. Now people are looking back at everything with fresh eyes, and suddenly the pieces are connecting. They are asking questions they should have asked a long time ago. Why were they always talking about you? Why were they always angry when you refused to respond? Why did every situation somehow become your fault? Why did your absence create more noise than your presence ever did? The answers are becoming clear. You weren't trying to destroy anyone. You weren't competing with anyone. You weren't plotting against anyone. You were simply trying to live, heal, grow, and protect your peace. And sometimes when someone cannot control you, they try to control the story people believe about you. But stories eventually collapse when reality refuses to cooperate. So don't rush back into the arguments now. Don't start explaining yourself to everyone. Don't interrupt the very process that is revealing the truth. Let them talk. Let them question. Let them observe. Let them finally recognize the difference between someone who constantly creates conflict and someone who simply refuses to participate in it. Your greatest response is not another argument. It is the life you continue building while the noise around you loses its power. The people who once misunderstood you may soon become the very people saying, "We got it wrong." And when that moment comes, remember this. You don't need to become bitter because you were misunderstood. You don't need to celebrate anyone's embarrassment. You simply need to stand firmly in the truth of who you are. Because when the noise finally fades, the truth doesn't have to scream. It simply remains. There comes a moment when a false story can no longer survive the weight of reality. For a long time, people may have heard things about you that were never completely true. They heard one side of the story, accepted someone else's version of events, and formed opinions before they ever gave you the opportunity to speak. Maybe your silence was interpreted as guilt. Maybe your boundaries were called arrogance. Maybe your decision to walk away from unnecessary conflict was described as weakness. And perhaps the most frustrating part was watching people believe it. But something is changing now. The very story that was designed to make you look like the problem is beginning to collapse under its own contradictions. People are starting to notice what they should have noticed from the beginning. Your behavior doesn't match the image that was created about you. You aren't constantly chasing arguments. You aren't running around trying to destroy people's reputations. You aren't spending every waking moment trying to prove yourself. You're simply living your life, protecting your peace, and moving forward. And that contrast is becoming impossible for people to ignore. Think about how powerful consistency is. Anyone can tell a convincing story once. Anyone can make themselves look innocent during one conversation. Anyone can point a finger when nobody is asking deeper questions. But maintaining a false narrative becomes difficult when reality keeps producing evidence that contradicts it. Eventually, people begin noticing patterns. They notice who constantly brings your name into conversations. They notice who becomes angry whenever you don't respond. They notice who keeps reopening situations that should have been left in the past. They notice who needs everyone to agree with them. And suddenly, the question changes. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with you?" they start asking, "Why are they so obsessed with talking about you?" That question can expose an entire situation without you saying a single word. Because when someone is genuinely at peace with moving on, they don't need to repeatedly convince everyone that another person is terrible. They simply move forward. But when someone keeps returning to the same story, repeating the same accusations, and demanding the same validation, people eventually become curious about what they're not being told. Your silence may have confused people in the beginning, but now it is becoming one of the strongest pieces of evidence. You didn't respond because you understood something they didn't. Not every accusation deserves an explanation. Not every rumor deserves a reaction. Not every person deserves access to your energy. You realize that constantly defending yourself could keep you trapped inside a conversation you had already outgrown. So you stepped back, you allowed time to pass, you allowed people to observe, and while you were doing that, something remarkable happened. Your life continued. You kept becoming stronger. You kept improving. You kept showing up with consistency. The person they described and the person people actually encountered were two completely different individuals. That difference eventually forces people to reconsider what they were told. And don't underestimate what happens when someone realizes they judged you unfairly. At first, they may become quiet. They may not immediately apologize. Pride can make people uncomfortable admitting that they were wrong. But internally, they begin replaying conversations. They remember what they were told. They remember how quickly they believed it. They remember how you reacted, or perhaps how you didn't react. They begin comparing the accusations with what they have personally witnessed. And slowly, their perspective changes. They realize that maybe you weren't cold. You were protecting yourself. Maybe you weren't arrogant. You were simply no longer available for disrespect. Maybe you weren't causing division. You were removing yourself from it. Maybe you weren't difficult. You were finally setting boundaries with people who had become comfortable crossing them. This is where your greatest victory begins. Not when everyone suddenly loves you, but when you no longer need everyone to understand you. That's freedom. You stop measuring your worth by other people's opinions. You stop checking who believes you and who doesn't. You stop worrying about who is talking behind your back. You understand that people who genuinely matter will judge you by your character, not by someone else's accusations. And the beautiful thing about truth is that it doesn't require constant promotion. Truth can survive silence. Truth can survive distance. Truth can survive misunderstanding. Eventually, truth finds its way into the light because reality keeps repeating itself. So if people are finally beginning to realize that you were never the problem, don't become desperate to remind them. Don't chase their approval. Don't demand that they apologize. Let their realization belong to them. Your responsibility is to keep becoming the person you fought so hard to become. Keep your heart clean. Keep your boundaries strong. Keep your peace protected. Keep moving forward. Because the greatest response to a false story isn't creating another story. It's living so authentically that the truth becomes undeniable. One day, the people who once questioned you may look back and realize that while everyone else was arguing about you, you were quietly becoming stronger without them. And that's when they will understand the part they missed all along. You weren't fighting to prove that you were innocent. You were simply building a life that made their accusations impossible to believe. There is a strange moment that happens when people finally become tired of the drama surrounding your name. At first, they may have listened because they were curious. They may have entertained the arguments because they thought there was something important behind all the noise. They may have believed that every accusation, every complaint, and every repeated story had to mean something. But eventually, constant negativity loses its power. When someone keeps talking about the same person, keeps bringing up the same conflict, and keeps trying to convince everyone that they are the victim, people eventually stop listening and start observing. And when they observe closely, they may discover something completely different from what they were told. They may discover that you are not running around trying to create enemies. You are not demanding attention. You are not constantly explaining yourself. You are not chasing anyone for approval. You are simply living your life. Meanwhile, the people who claimed they had moved on are still talking about you. That contradiction speaks louder than any defense ever could. Maybe there was a time when you wondered why your name kept appearing in conversations you weren't even part of. You wondered why people seemed determined to misunderstand you. You wondered why someone could claim they didn't care about you while constantly discussing what you were doing, where you were going, who you were with, and how your life was changing. It can feel exhausting when someone refuses to let you exist peacefully after you've already walked away. But here's what you need to understand. You don't have to enter every conversation simply because someone mentions your name. You don't have to correct every rumor. You don't have to chase every person who misunderstood you. There is power in realizing that not every battle deserves your presence. Sometimes your absence is the very thing that exposes the people who were creating the conflict. People eventually become exhausted when they realize they are being repeatedly pulled into someone else's emotional storm. They don't want to keep choosing sides. They don't want to hear another explanation about what you supposedly did. They don't want another argument. They don't want another dramatic phone call or another conversation filled with accusations. They want peace. And when they start wanting peace, they naturally begin questioning who keeps disturbing it. Suddenly, the person who was always described as the problem may not look like the problem anymore. They start remembering your behavior. They remember that you rarely started the arguments. They remember that you often walked away instead of escalating things. They remember that you tried to keep certain situations private. They remember that you didn't constantly demand that everyone take your side. Those small details begin forming a much bigger picture, and this is why you should never underestimate the power of simply being consistent. You don't have to perform goodness for an audience. You don't have to pretend to be perfect. You just have to remain authentic. If someone claims you're selfish, but everyone sees you helping others, the contradiction becomes visible. If someone claims you're hateful, but you continue treating people with respect, the contradiction becomes visible. If someone claims you're obsessed with them while you are clearly focused on your own life, the contradiction becomes visible. You don't have to point it out. People have eyes, they have memories. They eventually compare what they were told with what they personally witnessed. Some people may even begin distancing themselves from the drama without announcing it. They may stop responding to certain messages. They may stop entertaining certain conversations. They may stop agreeing with every accusation. They may become quieter whenever your name comes up. And that silence doesn't necessarily mean they are against you. Sometimes it means they are finally refusing to participate in something that no longer makes sense. The argument has lost its audience. The story has lost its power. The performance has lost its stage. But here's where you must be careful. When people begin realizing the truth, don't rush toward them with a list of everything you were right about. Don't say, "I told you so." Don't use their awakening as an opportunity to humiliate the person who misunderstood you. That's not your assignment. Your victory is not watching someone else lose. Your victory is becoming so emotionally free that you no longer need their downfall to validate your growth. Let people discover the truth at their own pace. Let them process what they believed. Let them recognize their mistakes without you forcing them to admit them. Because there is something incredibly powerful about being misunderstood and still refusing to become bitter. You could have allowed their accusations to change your character. You could have become angry, suspicious, and consumed by proving yourself. Instead, you chose another path. You chose to keep moving. You chose to protect your peace. You chose to focus on what you could control. And now, the same people who once expected you to remain trapped inside their version of you are watching you move beyond it. So let them talk less. Let them question more. Let them observe your life without the filter of someone else's narrative. The truth does not need a marketing campaign. It doesn't need a courtroom of spectators. It simply needs time. Eventually, people become tired of hearing noise, and when the noise becomes unbearable, they start searching for peace. And when they search for peace, they may finally recognize that you were never the disturbance they were told you were. You were simply the person who had the courage to walk away from the noise, and now everyone else is finally realizing why. There is a powerful moment when people stop listening to what someone says about you and start paying attention to what you actually do. For a long time, your silence may have been misunderstood. People may have assumed that because you didn't defend yourself loudly, you had something to hide. They may have mistaken your patience for weakness, your distance for guilt, and your refusal to argue for an admission that their accusations were true. But silence has a different meaning when it comes from someone who knows the truth. You didn't stay quiet because you were afraid. You stayed quiet because you understood that some arguments are designed to consume your energy rather than uncover the truth. You realized that if someone had already decided to misunderstand you, no explanation would ever be enough. So instead of chasing every accusation, you chose to let your actions speak. And now those actions are becoming the evidence that words could never provide. Think about what happens when someone repeatedly tells people that you are a certain kind of person, but every encounter those people have with you tells them something completely different. Eventually, confusion begins. They start asking themselves why the person they were warned about doesn't behave the way they expected. Maybe they expected arrogance and found humility. Maybe they expected hostility and found calmness. Maybe they expected you to be bitter, but instead they saw you continuing to live, smile, work, grow, and move forward. That contrast is powerful. You don't have to stand in front of everyone and announce that someone lied about you. Reality begins doing that for you. Every consistent action becomes another piece of evidence. Every peaceful decision becomes another contradiction. Every time you refuse to participate in unnecessary drama, people get another opportunity to recognize the truth. Your silence became especially powerful because you didn't use it as a weapon. You didn't disappear just to make people chase you. You didn't stop responding because you wanted attention. You simply decided that your peace was more valuable than winning an argument. That's a level of maturity many people don't understand until they experience it themselves. There are people who can only feel powerful when they are controlling a conversation. They need reactions. They need emotional responses. They need you to become angry so they can point at your anger and say, "See, this is exactly what I was talking about." But when you refuse to give them that reaction, their narrative becomes harder to maintain. They can accuse you, but your behavior doesn't support the accusation. They can provoke you, but you remain composed. They can talk about you, but you keep moving. And eventually, people begin noticing who is actually creating the chaos. This is why your consistency matters more than your explanation. Anyone can behave well for a few minutes when people are watching. Anyone can create a convincing image, but character reveals itself over time. The way you treat people when you have nothing to gain tells a story. The way you handle disappointment tells a story. The way you respond when someone insults you tells a story. The way you behave when nobody is applauding tells a story. And if your life consistently contradicts the accusations being made against you, eventually people have to make a choice between the story they were given and the reality they can see. More and more, reality wins. There may even be people who secretly regret how quickly they judged you. They may never admit it immediately because admitting they were wrong requires humility. But you can sometimes see the change in their behavior. The tone becomes different. The questions become different. The unnecessary suspicion disappears. They may begin treating you with more respect. They may stop participating when someone tries to criticize you. They may even defend you when you're not there. And perhaps you won't hear about any of it. That's okay. You don't need to know every conversation happening behind closed doors. Your peace doesn't depend on receiving reports about who finally understands you. Let them discover you for themselves. Let them experience your character without someone else's interpretation standing between them. You don't need to control what people believe. You don't need to manage your reputation every second. You need to live in a way that you can respect when you are alone with yourself. Because when you know who you are, false opinions become less threatening. Someone can misunderstand you, but they cannot redefine you. Someone can spread a story, but they cannot rewrite your character. Someone can attempt to make you look small, but they cannot reduce the person you are becoming. And maybe this is the greatest lesson from everything you've experienced. Sometimes you don't win by speaking louder. Sometimes you win by remaining steady. Sometimes you don't defeat an accusation by fighting it. You defeat it by living beyond it. You don't have to chase people down and force them to believe you. Give them time. Give them space. Give reality the opportunity to reveal what arguments tried to conceal. Your life can become the testimony your words never had to be. So keep walking with dignity. Keep your heart free from revenge. Keep your boundaries strong. Keep refusing invitations into unnecessary chaos. One day, people may look back and realize that the very silence they once interpreted as weakness was actually your greatest strength. You didn't need to destroy the false story. You simply outlived it. And eventually, the truth became louder than everything they said about you. There comes a point when the truth doesn't need another argument, another explanation, or another person standing up to defend it because the pattern has become too obvious to ignore. For so long, you may have watched people misunderstand you while someone else controlled the narrative. They pointed fingers, created confusion, repeated their version of events, and somehow managed to make you appear responsible for problems you never created. You may have wondered how people could believe it so easily. You may have felt frustrated because you knew the truth, yet you couldn't force anyone else to see it. But now something is changing. People are no longer simply listening to what is being said. They are watching what is happening. They are paying attention to patterns, reactions, behavior, and consistency. And when people start observing instead of blindly believing, the entire picture can change. They are beginning to recognize who repeatedly creates the tension. They are noticing who always needs an argument. They are seeing who constantly brings old situations back into the present. They are noticing who becomes uncomfortable whenever you succeed, become peaceful, or stop responding. They are beginning to understand that your decision to distance yourself wasn't an attack, it was a boundary. Your silence wasn't punishment, it was protection. Your absence wasn't manipulation, it was freedom. And this realization can be uncomfortable for people who once believed the opposite. Because admitting that they misunderstood you means admitting that they may have participated in something unfair. It means acknowledging that they judged you before knowing the whole story. It means recognizing that perhaps the person they were defending wasn't as innocent as they assumed. But you don't need to force that realization. Let it happen naturally. There is something powerful about allowing people to discover the truth without standing over them, demanding that they admit you were right. When you stop trying to control their opinions, you become free from their opinions. You don't need to monitor every conversation. You don't need to ask who is talking about you. You don't need to investigate who finally changed their mind. Your responsibility is to protect the peace you worked so hard to rebuild. The moment you stop needing everyone to understand you is the moment their misunderstanding loses its ability to control you. And perhaps the most remarkable thing happening now is that people are becoming tired of being used as an audience. They are realizing that constant arguments are draining. Constant negativity is exhausting. Being repeatedly asked to choose sides is uncomfortable. Eventually, even people who once enjoyed the drama start craving peace. They begin stepping away from conversations that revolve around you. They stop reacting to provocative comments. They stop accepting every accusation as fact. They start asking questions. And questions are dangerous to a false narrative because questions require evidence. When people begin asking what actually happened, or why does this keep happening, the story becomes much harder to control. Meanwhile, you are learning one of the greatest lessons of maturity. You cannot control what people say, but you can control what you become because of it. You could allow betrayal to make you bitter. You could allow false accusations to make you suspicious of everyone. You could spend years trying to prove that you were misunderstood, but you don't have to live that way. You can choose peace without pretending the pain never happened. You can forgive without giving everyone access to you again. You can move forward without forgetting what the experience taught you. You can become wiser without becoming colder. There may be people who eventually come back with a different attitude. They may not know exactly how to apologize. They may approach you cautiously. They may act as though nothing happened because pride makes honesty difficult. Don't let that confuse you. Sometimes people need time to process what they have realized. You don't have to punish them, and you don't have to immediately restore the relationship either. You can simply observe. Let their actions demonstrate whether their change is genuine. Words can be emotional, but consistency reveals intention. Most importantly, don't allow their awakening to pull you back into the same environment you escaped. If people finally realize you weren't the problem, that's wonderful. But you don't have to return to the place where you were constantly treated like one. Your growth has already taken you somewhere else. Your peace has become more valuable. Your standards have become clearer. Your boundaries have become stronger. And your future deserves more attention than your past. So let the truth continue unfolding. Let people watch. Let them question. Let them recognize the patterns for themselves. You don't need to point at anyone. You don't need to celebrate anyone's embarrassment. You don't need to become what hurt you. Keep your heart steady and your focus forward. Because sometimes the greatest vindication isn't hearing someone say, "You were right." Sometimes it is realizing that you no longer care whether they admit it. You know who you are. You know what you survived. You know what you refused to become. And now, as the noise fades and the truth becomes clearer, remember this. The people who once thought you were creating the chaos may finally realize that you were the one trying to escape it. You weren't the storm. You were the person searching for peace while everyone else was still arguing about the rain. There is a beautiful kind of victory that happens when you no longer need to convince anyone of who you are because your life has already become the answer. For a long time, you may have carried the frustration of being misunderstood. You watched people believe stories about you that didn't reflect your heart, your intentions, or your actions. You watched conversations happen behind your back. You watched people take sides without knowing the whole truth. You may have wanted to explain everything, expose every lie, and make every person who judged you understand exactly what happened. But somewhere along the way, you discovered something far more powerful. You don't have to chase vindication when the truth has time on its side. Time reveals motives. Time reveals patterns. Time reveals character. And while people were busy arguing about you, time was quietly revealing who you really were. Now the atmosphere is changing. The people who once accepted every accusation without question are beginning to see things differently. They are noticing that your life doesn't resemble the story they were given. They expected you to remain angry, broken, desperate, or consumed by the conflict. Instead, you kept moving. You became quieter, wiser, stronger, and more selective about where you placed your energy. You stopped explaining yourself to people who had already decided what they wanted to believe. You stopped chasing people who only valued you when you were available for their drama. You stopped trying to repair relationships where respect was constantly missing. And in doing so, you discovered a freedom that cannot be purchased, the freedom to live without constantly defending your existence. Maybe the people who once criticized you are now watching your life from a distance. They see that you're not collapsing without their approval. They see that you're not begging to be accepted. They see that you are building a future that doesn't depend on whether they acknowledge your worth. That can be the people who assumed you needed them. They may have mistaken your kindness for dependence. They may have mistaken your patience for weakness. They may have assumed that, because you cared deeply, you would tolerate anything. But you learned the difference between loving people and allowing people to mistreat you. You learned that forgiveness doesn't require permanent access. You learned that compassion doesn't mean having no boundaries. You learned that peace sometimes requires walking away from people you once hoped would change. And now the very people who participated in the arguments may be becoming tired of them. They may be exhausted by the constant negativity, the repeated accusations, and the endless need to revisit the same situations. At some point, people begin craving something different. They want peace. They want honesty. They want conversations that don't revolve around tearing someone else down. And when they look at you, they may realize that you had already chosen that path. You weren't running away from responsibility. You were running away from unnecessary chaos. You weren't refusing to communicate. You were refusing to keep communicating in an environment where every word was twisted against you. This is why you should resist the temptation to return and say, "Now do you believe me?" Let them believe what they believe. Let them process what they finally see. You don't need to stand at the door of their realization waiting for applause. Your life is bigger than their opinion. Your future is more important than their apology. Your peace is more valuable than winning an argument that should never have existed in the first place. If someone finally understands you, receive that understanding with humility. If someone apologizes, decide wisely whether their actions support their words. But don't rebuild your identity around being vindicated, because the real transformation happens when you stop needing the people who misunderstood you to become witnesses to your success. You don't need them watching when you achieve your goals. You don't need them regretting what they did. You don't need them secretly comparing their lives to yours. You don't need their jealousy, their guilt, or their regret to prove that you made the right decision. Your peace is proof enough. Your growth is proof enough. Your ability to wake up without carrying yesterday's anger is proof enough. And if some people are finally realizing that you were never the problem, let that realization teach them what arguments couldn't. Maybe they will become more careful with the next person they judge. Maybe they'll stop believing every story without asking questions. Maybe they'll learn that there are always two sides to a conflict. If that happens, something good has come from something painful. You don't have to carry hatred toward them. You can simply carry wisdom. So walk forward without looking back every 5 minutes to see who finally understands. The chapter is closing because you have outgrown the role they assigned you. You were never required to become their villain just because they needed someone to blame. You were never required to stay in an environment where peace was treated like weakness. And you were never required to spend your life proving that you deserve respect. The right people will recognize your character through your actions. Let them talk less. Let them observe more. Let the noise disappear. Let the truth remain. Because the greatest victory isn't when everyone gathers around and announces that you were innocent. The greatest victory is when you wake up one morning and realize you don't even need the announcement anymore. You survived being misunderstood without allowing misunderstanding to change who you are. And now, while they are finally realizing that you were never the problem, you are already walking toward a life where the problem no longer has access to you.